this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is Lian Li's Hydroshift LCD 360R, and in this video I'm going to show you how to set up and wire this all-in-one cooler with both Intel and AMD motherboards. I'll leave links in the description to timestamps so you can jump to specific parts depending on what build you're doing. But I'm going to show you the setup and wiring process for both, and what you're to do with the software, and some other hints on how to set the cooler up along the way, including swapping the fans out if you want to for SL120V2s or other Lian Li fans, and the things to bear in mind along the way there. The Hydroshift is designed with the tubes along the side so that the tubes from the radiator and the pump are neatly hidden away. You'll see there is a plastic housing here which you can take off, and this does actually allow you to reposition the tubes and cables as well, depending on where you're seating it. But as standard, it's designed to top mount into your case, and I would recommend doing that. And as you'll see underneath, the cables for the fans run through the tube housing all the way to the pump itself. And then you have 3 connectors there, which I'll show you where to plug in later on. This keeps everything really nice and neat and fairly straightforward with the wiring and installation process on both AMD and Intel platforms. So we're going to start with an AMD AM5 socket motherboard. And the first thing you need to do is to remove the standoffs that are already pre-installed in here. So you need to remove this bracketing by unscrewing the screws at the top and bottom below the CPU. Now, note that you need to keep the screws from here, but remove these plastic clips because we're going to be reusing the screws with the standoffs that are included with the cooler. This is actually fairly straightforward, and it will be the same across all AM5 socket motherboards. But then you have these standoffs that you put down in place instead, and you need to use the screws again to put them back in. Note the angle and the way that I've put this in so they face with the points pushing downwards. This is the housing that the cooler will sit on top of. The bottom one mirrors the top, so it basically faces upwards, and you secure these down fully onto the motherboard itself. I'm doing this outside the case, so it's really easy to see and easy to do. And then what we want to do is then go about the process of installing the motherboard into your case. In this instance, the Corsair 6500X. And then naturally go about securing the motherboard with the screws included with the case. Then what you need to do is to work out how you're going to seat the all-in-one cooler down. Now I'm top mounting it here, and you want to make sure the tubes are at the top of the pump, so the display. And the idea here is to hide as much of the tubing away as possible and make it nice and neat so you can adjust that. And I'll show you how to adjust the tubes on the rad later on if you're curious. But what you want to do is then secure it with the small screws to the top of the case. Now I'm using a thermal paste guard here from Noctua to keep things nice and clean with an AM5 socket motherboard. This slips down over the top of the CPU and essentially stops the thermal paste from squidging out over the edges. You put your thermal paste down that's included with the cooler, and I would recommend spreading it out to cover the entirety of the CPU. This makes sure you get good thermal coverage and that the cooling is efficient when in use. You might prefer just to put a large blob down, but don't forget to peel that sticker off of the top of the cooler before you seat it down over that thermal paste. So we're dropping it down on top of the CPU gently and then securing it by screwing the standoff screws into the housing that we put onto the motherboard. Go corner to corner, opposite corners, and keep screwing it until you can't screw any further. Take care not to over tighten, but just screw these until they stop and make sure all 4 corners are nicely secured, and that will ensure that you have good cooling there. Now for the cabling, we have a couple of different cables to think about. The one here is plugging into the CPU fan header on your motherboard, and that will help the system control both the pump speed and the fan speed on the radiator. You then need to run the other cable to the rear, and what you want to make sure here is that you plug those in properly. So one is the SATA power connector, which is the flat power connector that comes from the power supply unit. It has an L shape to it, so you can only plug it in one way. And then you have a cable that runs to the USB port on your motherboard. This plugs into the bottom middle of the motherboard there, and that will allow you to control the RGB lighting and the display using L-Connect, which I'll show you how to use later on, so stick around to the end of the video to see that. But then you can do a test boot and you should see the fans light up and the display showing the Lian Li logo and not much else until you go into the software. So watch out for that. You then have some plastic housing which sits down over the top of the standoff screws just to neaten things up. And now we're on to the Intel build. So this is an LGA 1700 socket motherboard which will work with 12th, 13th and 14th gen Intel CPUs, and this is for demonstration purposes on how you do this, but essentially there's a back plate for this, so it's a little bit more complicated than the AMD setup because you need to install this back plate. There are some 3M stickers on the back here, so remove these pads that cover them and then seat this down over the back of the motherboard. And this is easier to do when it's outside the case, but it is possible in some cases to do it. And then you can put these down over the top. So you've got these plastic standoffs that sit over the top of the standoff screws that pass through. If you push them through into each of the 4 standoffs, that will then secure those in place and make sure they don't move around. And then when the cooler is installed in the case and the motherboard is, just don't forget to peel that sticker off and apply thermal paste, as I'll show you in a second. And then you would seat the cooler down. Make sure the tubes are at the top of the pump, and that will ensure that everything's nice and neat. And then you secure it by screwing the 4 screws down onto the standoffs that we've just installed there. So make sure you secure all 4 corners and that they're tightened up nicely. You plug the single cable that comes out of the pump into the CPU fan header on your motherboard, which is usually located on the top right. The USB connection goes into the bottom middle of the motherboard, which is essential because you'll need that to control the display on the all-in-one cooler and the RGB lighting, which I'll get to in a little while. Now, if you want to, you can remove the fans that come as standard on this cooler. There are radiator screws here that will need to be removed naturally, and it's worth noting that I'm using the SL120V2 fans, but you could opt for some other fans if you wanted to make sure that your case was uniform. So if you had Lian Li fans throughout your case and you wanted to make sure you got the same ones on the radiator, it is possible, but there are some things to note because it does make things a little bit more complicated. So the fan cabling naturally runs into the end here, as I've shown already, and connects up near the tubes, and then obviously runs through to the pump and plugs into the motherboard and to the power. And in order to get that out, it does make things a little bit more complicated because the cables for the fans are through in a point where you'd need to remove the tubes first. So if you remove these side brackets here by unscrewing the little screws, you can then make this a little bit easier to do. It's worth noting, as you can see, that you can actually move these around on the radiator as well, so you can adjust them. There are multiple points for those brackets, which I'll show you again in a second, because you can actually have an additional one as well that's included in the packet. But you'll see once you've taken that off, you can then access those fan cables to remove the standard fans. You obviously then have loose cable that runs to the cooler, which isn't ideal necessarily. And these fans are obviously going to be very capable of cooling the coolant in the radiator because that's obviously what they're designed for. So you might be sacrificing some cooling performance by swapping the fans out, it's worth noting. And as you can see, these are interlocking fans with a good build quality to them. However, what we want to do here is swap them out so that they're the same fans across the case. And the process, I'm happy to report, is reasonably easy, although it does complicate things a little bit versus the standard build, so it is worth noting that. Installing the fans in the same direction with the SL120V2s, so the blades are facing towards us, which means they'll be facing down into the case, so exhausting air from the case out through the radiator and out of the top. You'll notice obviously we've got this flat connector with the V2 fans, which I'm trying to get through the gap here so that I can run the thin cable through and try and keep things neat, because obviously the design of this all-in-one cooler means that the housing can hide away a lot of the cables, and it would be nice to be able to achieve the same result here, which you might not be able to do with other fans necessarily, but with the SL120V2s, the cable is nice and thin here, so it's pretty easy to adjust. Then we're reinstalling the fans onto the radiator using the same screws we removed from the standard pre-installed fans. They just fit through the same holes and screw into the radiator with relative ease. The housing here will just take those quite easily. You can screw them back in, it shouldn't be a problem. Now obviously the difference here is the wiring is going to be slightly different, which I'll show you later on, because the fans aren't connecting to the pump. Also, we've got to think about how we're repositioning the tubing. Now I made a mistake here, and I want you to note this as it's important, especially if you're trying to keep things nice and neat. We're securing the bracketing back onto this to keep the tubes tidy. And as I said, you can use 2 of the standard brackets that are already installed. You can opt to add a 3rd one, and you can actually reposition them. It's worth looking at how the tubes are going to sit in the case, though, because the way I ended up putting the tubes back on actually results in a slight bend to the tubes where they're pushing off at a bit of a weird angle. So I thought initially it would be better to have this extra bracket on here, and that would keep things nice and neat. But what I discovered, and as you'll see later on, is actually this results in those tubes being off at a weird angle, which might upset some people, and we'll probably get some negative comments in the video where people haven't paid enough attention to what I'm saying now. So you can see that you can do that and you can secure it down, and I think this is going to depend on your case because it might vary depending on how the radiator is sitting, where that's sitting on the top of the case, for example. But you might not want to use this additional bracket. It's worth noting. So that's one thing to bear in mind. So what I found was that obviously put the plastic housing back on top of the cables. So the important part here is to hide that cable away from the fans. And what I found is because it's nice and flat, you can actually stick it underneath the housing that goes back over there. It is possible to run that over through the gap, basically down the side where the tubes are, and then to put the plastic housing back over the top. This might not be as easy with other fans, but the important point is to run it towards the back of the radiator so that when you put it in the case, you'll be able to hide those cables away by running them towards the rear of the case and then plugging them into the controller. This will keep things nice and neat because obviously that's the goal with this cooler, keep the tubes and the wiring out of the way and invisible as possible. And we can then set this up so that we can control the fan speed from L-Connect, which I'll show you in a bit. Now, I mentioned earlier on that you can put the standoffs through for the motherboard into the motherboard before you install it in the case. But if you've got a case like this, which is the NZXT H7 RGB Flow, you can actually remove that and access the back plate so that you can install the standoffs while it's in the case. So it is possible to do. I just find it easier personally to install it on the motherboard before you install the motherboard. I wanted to show you both options so that you can see that. And then I have to obviously reseat the hard disk drive and SSD tray over the top of it and put that back in place there. But otherwise it's fairly straightforward to do that. And then we just go about preparing the motherboard. So as a reminder, you need to make sure you've got these plastic standoffs sitting over the top of the standard standoffs that are coming through, and then install the all-in-one cooler into the case. So we're going to mount it at the top of the case here, obviously with the silver Lian Li part facing towards you. And we need to secure it to the top using the small screws that are included with the box. So you're basically going to secure it there. And you obviously have a lot of screws here that we need to secure across it. It's worth noting you might want to keep some of them a little bit loose so you can adjust the position of the radiator. You can see with this case there's a bit of movement where you can move it to the left or to the right to adjust the position. And this might help neaten the tubes up on the pump. Then you use the thermal paste that's included with the all-in-one cooler, put a blob down in the center of the CPU, and I personally would then use a spatula to spread it out across the IHS so that you've got good thermal conductivity there. Peel the sticker off the copper plate to make sure that's removed first of all, and then you're going to seat that pump down on top of the CPU, and we then need to obviously carefully seat it down on the standoffs that we put through. Be careful there because you don't want to rub the thermal paste off while doing it. And then you need to secure the screws down. So use a screwdriver and screw those in corner to corner, making sure to tighten them all the way up. Tighten them until they stop turning and they won't turn any further. Don't force it, don't over tighten them, but just screw those until you can't do it anymore. And make sure you do all of them so that they're all tight. If any of them are loose, then you might have problems with cooling. Then for the cabling, as a reminder, you have a small cable that comes out of it on its own. That plugs into the CPU fan header on the motherboard. That plugs in there in the top right. And then you run the other cables to the rear, including the ones from the pump and obviously those fan cables as well. We want to run those to the back, down through the case, and then we'll plug them in the right places because obviously you want to make sure that's nice and neat. So you sort that out as much as you can now and run those out of the way. There's also that housing that sits over the top of the pump and hides away the screws there that's worth installing. Then you have the power cable on the right hand side and USB cable. These are very important. So make sure you plug that SATA power connection into the flat power cable that comes with your power supply unit, the same cable that's used for SSDs and hard disk drives. This has an L shape to it. You need to make sure it notches into this cable and plugs in. It'll only plug in one way, but it's very important that you do that. Otherwise, the pump won't work and you won't get the results that you want out of it. And then the USB connection runs to the bottom middle of the motherboard and plugs in there. Now, with the fans that we put on the radiator, run them to the controller that you've got with the SL120V2 fans or other controller you've got, and make sure you make a mental note of the port that you used. So I'm using port 1 here, for example, and I'll show you why in a second, because obviously all the other fans are going to plug in from the other parts of the case. So I've got fans on the bottom, on the front, and at the rear, and those will plug into the other ports, and we'll be controlling those separately. That also needs to be plugged into SATA power and to the USB header, and then you'll be able to control everything from L-Connect and make sure that the fan speeds are running properly. Here I'm using the Shift power supply unit, by the way, which has both the power for it and a USB hub as well, which is worth noting. So you can plug multiple USB devices into that power supply unit and then into the motherboard. I've done a separate video on that. But the important point is making sure that both the controller and the pump are both plugged into a USB connection on your motherboard, either via that hub or directly. And then this will ensure that you can control both easily. And then you can do a test boot to make sure everything's running properly. You can see all the fans are lighting up as they should be and spinning. And if you wait a second, you'll see the display come on. If the display doesn't come on, perhaps you've not plugged in those cables properly, so it's worth double checking what I've shown you. And then peel the protective film off of the display, and then you should see that Lian Li logo until we get into Windows and download L-Connect and then change some of the settings there. So that's the installation process for that. And as I mentioned, you'll see the tubes on my radiator are sitting off a bit of a wonky angle, not ideal. So hopefully with my hints, you'll be able to sort that out so yours don't look the same. There are various customizable displays that you can adjust through in L-Connect to make this cooler look really nice, including both clocks and temperature readouts and just really nice scenes and your own custom images. There's all sorts of things that you can do in here. But obviously to do this, you need to first download L-Connect and change some of the settings in there. So once we're into Windows, you want to open up Chrome and go over to Google and then search for L-Connect 3 and head over to the Lian Li website. Make sure it's Lian Li and not that dodgy advert at the top of the page there. Then we go down and we want to download the distributable packages for C++ if you've not got them already, and run those and L-Connect 3, and then download that and install it. Once you've got it installed, you should hopefully see the Hydroshift LCD display on the left-hand side there, as well as the SL120V2 fans separately, so the option of both of those. Under the fan and pump profiles on the top left menu, you should find the fans showing up that we had on the SL120 controller. Now, don't forget that we used port 1 for the fans that are on the radiator. If you look here, you'll see that you can adjust the fans to spin according to the CPU temperature. So note that, because you can adjust the fan profile on the bottom left there to adjust between quiet, standard, high speed and full speed. But more importantly, you can just set a fan curve so that these fans will change their speed according to the CPU temps. You might want to change the other ones in the case to respond to the GPU temperatures, for example. But it's important to keep the ones on the radiator responding to the CPU temperatures. That way they'll speed up when the CPU gets too hot, as will the pump, and therefore the whole thing will keep everything nice and cool with L-Connect running. And that should then ensure a nice bit of speed. I personally like to run it on quiet. You'll find the whole system nice and quiet there. Then if you go to the Hydroshift LCD settings, you can then change between the various different themes on the display. So you can choose from the various different styles in there. There are a lot of different ones to choose from, whether you want to see the various different performance metrics or just some nice effects on there and clocks and other things. You can also adjust the fan pump profile from this page as well and change a lot of different things. I would recommend checking into the settings as well and check for updates on your controllers. It's worth doing this regularly, but especially when you initially install it. And then hopefully you've got a nice system that runs nice and quiet and efficiently and looks the business too. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, check out the links in the description to related content that you also might find helpful. And thanks very much for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.